no signs of forced entry. Folks, that's a myth. No signs of forced entry. At that time, there were 8 signs of forced entry documented by Boulder police officers.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Although this was hardly my first visit to Boulder, I probably couldn't have penned this analysis with the same crystal clear precision without visiting it 2 more times. It was really on my 3rd visit that some sparkling insights emerged, some new and some refinements of other intuitions. Interestingly, this didn't happen by design, but kind of the opposite. My original plan for my 3rd visit to Boulder was much like the first 2 visits, to head south to Salida and Moffat to investigate another case, the Morphew case. But then as a result of a combination of bad luck, bad weather, and just happenstance, I guess, I ended up staying in Boulder for 3 days. And so for the first time ever, really, I've actually experienced Boulder properly. So we're going to examine in almost microscopic detail 3 separate areas of the RAMSEY case in a brand new way: leaves, bikes, and bucks. For the purpose of this analysis, we'll restrict ourselves only to the first. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I do have a Spotify channel, True Crime Rocket Science on Spotify. If you haven't, or if you aren't following that, please do. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So in this analysis, we're going to deal with leaves. I have to say, Boulder in May is truly magical. The trees are bursting with new leaves, the fields are an emerald green, and the flatirons rise through this fabric like ancient grandparents greeting you from afar. This is also the time that college students hold graduation parties, attend swanky dinners, and arrange professional photographers to capture the moment. It's a celebration of the end of one phase of life and the beginning of another. And although it likely happens the world over, the folks who live in Boulder and the trust fund kids who study here occupy a kind of rarefied atmosphere that not only the average South African can only dream of, but most Americans as well. Coming to Boulder at the beginning of summer is obviously a vast contrast to Boulder and Colorado in the middle of winter, which is when the incident involving JONBENET RAMSEY occurred. Now, it's obviously more of a contrast being in Boulder almost 4.5 months after the incident in real time, in terms of the timeline, than Lou Smith coming to the case 3 months after the fact. What I'm trying to say is I was there even later than when Lou Smith came into the case. But the point remains that when the chief apologist for the intruder theory arrived in Boulder, the last vestiges of winter were virtually gone. And what is the main difference, broadly speaking, between summer and winter? Well, summer involves green lawns and leaves that whisper and flicker from their lofty perches. In winter, the ground is littered and tickled by leaves scratching across sidewalks as icy winter winds blow them along. Now, I know what you're thinking. You may say bringing up leaves in the RAMSEY case isn't only reaching, but the kind of gratuitous overreach one might expect from an author of around a dozen books on the RAMSEY case who is finally finding the well dry and running out of things to say. Well, far from it. Leaves are not only relevant to the fabric of Boulder, more specifically the suburban stretch of University Hill and Lower Chautauqua Park. Am I saying that right? Chautauqua Park, the boundary between University Hill and Lower Chautauqua Park, and then even more particularly the RAMSEY home. But it's also relevant to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, Lawrence Schiller's definitive encyclopedia on the RAMSEY case, which, do you remember, it opens with an anecdote about leaves. Let's go to that anecdote right now. from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town by Lawrence Schiller. And Lawrence Schiller writes, in early December of 96, I was raking the blanket of leaves under a maple, getting the property ready for winter. Who is speaking here? Well, it is Brian Scott, the Ramsey's landscaper, and this is whom Schiller leans on for virtually the last words from JONBENET that we have a record of. So in other words, JONBENET Ramsey's last words basically form the opening words of her story. So these are the last words of JONBENET, but that's besides from her parents. So it's from a third party, kind of an independent party. Now, Brian Scott, basically a gardener, provides vital insight, not just into JONBENET, but something we've all missed outside of the Ramsey home. And this vital insight comes just 3 weeks before Christmas, when the 6-year-old says, don't pick the leaves up, please. Leave them for me to play with. And in the gardener's words, he said that JONBENET was basically begging him, please don't, rake up all the leaves, because she wants to play with them. And he responded, well, I'm thinking, no way, my job is to pick them up, and that's what I'm going to do. Last year, my dad and I did that. That's what JONBENET said. And then she said quietly, I really miss him. I wish he was around more. And then the little girl started to cry. And Scott, the gardener, felt uncomfortable, not knowing what to say. He said, I changed the subject and started to rake up the leaves. A moment later, I saw JONBENET was scooping up the leaves from the top of the barrel and hurling them over her head into the wind. Hey, stop that, I yelled. No, I want to play in them. She was being kind of bratty. She had a bit of a smart aleck in her. I grabbed the barrel and started running towards the compost pile. She chased after me, not about to give up her fun. I set the barrel down and she dumped all the leaves out. That made me angry, almost. But before long, I made a game out of it. It was fun for both of us. And this part's really important. That evening, Brian Scott writes, I left a big pile of leaves out front by the gutter for her to play with. That was probably the last time I spoke to JONBENET. Now, this is actually quite incredible. The last moments that this outsider has with JONBENET actually involves leaves. In fact, a big pile of leaves. Now, I don't know what tree Brian Scott was talking about. We know it's a maple tree, but I don't know exactly which tree it is. But in crime scene photos showing the exterior of the house, there's one big tree clearly standing sentinel in the front garden. The maple might be the bare tree on the right-hand side of this image. Notice the detritus on the snow below it. It's also not clear what gutter Brian Scott was referring to, but it was more than likely on the front side of the house behind the front door. In other words, the opposite side of the house to the grate supposedly used by the intruder, and ironically, very close to the wine cellar where JONBENET's body would eventually be found. In other words, this pile of leaves where JONBENET was playing was basically right outside the window where JONBENET's body would eventually be found. I know it wasn't found by a window, but certainly in that part of the house, right? We can see quite clearly in all three images of the bats, plant material, mostly leaves, lying around the garden. Now, by far the most desiccated plant debris is found on the same side of the house as the grate to the basement window. But there are also clearly leaf fragments underneath the other bats on the far side of the house as well. Now, typically when it comes to the exterior of the house, the focus is all about snow or no snow. You never hear about leaves, and I don't really need to prove the abundance of leaf debris. Like, in order to make my case, I really don't need to show leaves in the garden. I don't need to find that maple tree. I don't need to locate it. So I've actually gone way beyond the call of duty to show the leaf debris when we have an anecdote, both of JONBENET herself playing in the abundance of leaves in the garden at the time, in winter, just a few weeks before her death. So we know the leaves were there. And the gardener actually saying he deliberately left a pile out for her. Now you might say, well, there couldn't be any leaves if the gardener raked them all up, even if he put them in a pile. Well, I think what this shows is, he could have raked the leaves up a couple of weeks before and more leaves could have accumulated. But even that isn't a necessary argument to make, and I'll explain why in a moment. because the crucial evidence is actually right outside the basement window. You don't have to look at the lawn. You don't have to look at the garden. You don't have to look for a tree. The crucial evidence is actually right outside the basement window. Have you ever really looked at it? Do you see leaves down there? Besides leaves, there's a thick layer of dirt, and besides the dirt, there are easy to dislodge plastic popcorn, pieces of plastic popcorn packing foam, quite a lot of it. Where does that come from, and how did it get there? Specifically the packing foam. And this is where we finally come to it. What is wrong with this picture? This picture of Lou Smith getting into the grate, demonstrating himself getting in. Putting back slightly, what's wrong with this image? Well, the answer is that the image is from the wrong time of the year. That's one aspect to it. The other aspect is that Smith is doing the reenactment during the day. The ground is dry, the soil is dry, the grass is dry. So he's made two crucial errors straight off the bat, and both have to do with time. The time of the year and the time of day when he's doing his reenactment. Now, again, we don't need to go into too much detail, but it suffices to note at night or in the early morning hours in Boulder, in December, especially after a snowfall or rain or frost at a minimum, and we know that trace snow did fall in Boulder that night, well, you are likely to have moisture on the lawn. What happens when you have moisture or frost? Well, things like plant debris, things like pine needles, leaf fragments, dirt, all that sort of thing, attached to your clothing, to your shoes. And if you disbelieve what you're seeing in this particular image, number 87, which is frost, well, weather data overnight on the day after Christmas was 30 degrees Fahrenheit, in other words, freezing. So the weather data confirms that you would definitely have had frost. The frosting of a lawn is going to create moisture for any footwear that is stepping over it. And this means that anyone who approached the grate from the outside of the house would have moisture on their shoes, which, as I say, would have picked up leaves, pine needles, and dirt and brought these from outside the house inside. Now, even if you dismiss the entire argument made thus far and you say the intruder tippy-toed on the cement walkway, didn't set a toe onto a blade of frosted lawn, didn't in any event get any of that moisture on the shoes, and thus couldn't find a way to attach any of this plant debris to his footwear. And if you say, besides doing that, he also somehow levitated to the grate without touching the ground, well, it would be impossible to drop down to the grate, right, to that area just outside the basement window. It would be impossible to drop down onto that without touching that substrate, and then go through the window without touching the filthy windowsill directly outside. That windowsill had glass fragments, a spider's web, dirt, packing foam, but most importantly, leaf fragments, including pine needles. And leaf fragments, you don't necessarily even have to have attached to your clothing. They're the sort of things that you can dislodge, that they can move through the air. If you have a little bit of breath of wind or movement close to them, they can move, not of their own accord, but certainly through the motion of air around them. And so this is the pertinent question. Was any of this detritus seen beneath the open basement window? In other words, inside the basement, was there any sign of dirt or glass or leaves or pine needles or anything from the outside of that room? But it goes even further than that. If the intruder stepped onto this surface on the way in, and he had to, or if he stepped onto the surface on his way out, and I repeat, he had to, why is there no shoe print like we see in the grit of the basement? Hello, where is it? Do you see it? For Lou Smith's silly demonstration to hold any value, he needed to have done it under the exact same circumstances, in winter, at night, and with the same amount of dirt and spider web on the windowsill. Do you think he could enter the window and drop down into the basement without bringing any dirt or leaves with him? Now think, just in this simple analysis that I've provided here, it's sufficient to totally rubbish the intruder theory, because it is impossible to get into the house without bringing some dirt in with you. Have you ever skied and entered a house without leaving any trace of coming in from the outside? I'm not going to take it further than that, although I will continue into the fabric of the Ramsey case by dealing with two other subjects. The one, bicycles, and the other one, the big bucks of Boulder. And I'll explain how that fits into the fabric of this case. I hope you found this analysis worthwhile. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.